Emily Carson woke from a 2-month coma with a name on her lips. Her own brother, Daniel, the man she now claimed had murdered her 2 young children in cold blood. In a small town where everyone seemed to know each other's name, Emily Carson's life looked like the perfect picture of peace. She lived in a modest 2-story home, with white shutters and a small, well-kept garden filled with daisies and roses. Her 2 children, 8-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Noah, were the heart of her world. Each morning began with the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, the soft hum of the radio, and the sound of little feet racing down the stairs. Emily worked part-time as a librarian at the local library, a place she loved for its calm atmosphere and the endless rows of books that offered her an escape from reality whenever she needed it. Her neighbors often described her as warm and gentle, someone who would stop to ask about your day or lend a helping hand without hesitation. Lily was bright and full of energy, with a curious mind that seemed older than her years. Noah, quieter and more reserved, had a shy smile that could soften even the sternest faces. Together, the 3 of them shared a routine that felt safe, predictable, and untouched by the troubles of the world. Emily's life had not always been easy. There had been financial struggles and heartbreak in the past. But she had built a stable environment for her children. Most evenings, they would sit together at the dinner table, laughing over Lily's dramatic storytelling or Noah's clumsy attempts at jokes. On weekends, Emily would take them to the park where they'd fly kites or feed the ducks by the pond. It was the kind of simple, small-town life many people dreamed of, and Emily guarded it fiercely. But even in this picture of peace, there were shadows Emily didn't see. From time to time, she would notice a car parked too long near her house, or hear odd noises outside late at night. But she dismissed them as coincidences. She had no reason to suspect that danger was closing in, inching nearer with each passing day. That early autumn, the air was crisp, and the leaves painted the streets in shades of amber and gold. Emily had started planning for the holidays, talking to the children about decorating the tree and baking cookies together. She wanted to make this year special, but somewhere in the background, unknown to her, someone else had been watching, learning her habits and studying her home. Every lock she trusted, every window she thought was secure, was already part of someone's plan. Emily went to bed each night believing her world was safe. She kissed her children goodnight, turned off the lights, and trusted that nothing could harm them in the comfort of their own home. She could not have known that these were the last nights they would ever share together without fear. Something unthinkable was coming for her family, and it would strike with a cruelty she could never have imagined. The night of the tragedy began like any other. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the wind rattled the branches outside Emily's home. The air carried that damp, metallic scent that often comes before a storm. Emily tucked Lily and Noah into bed earlier than usual, hoping they would get a good night's sleep despite the thunder that was forecast. She checked the locks on the front and back doors, closed the windows, and left a soft nightlight glowing in the hallway. Upstairs, the house was quiet except for the faint sound of rain beginning to tap against the glass. By the time the storm fully arrived, the streets were nearly empty. The occasional flash of lightning lit up Emily's living room in sharp, ghostly bursts. She sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, sipping tea and reading a book. Every so often, she glanced toward the stairs, comforted by the thought of her children sleeping peacefully. Outside, the rain grew heavier, and the wind carried a low, constant howl. Somewhere past midnight, the sound of shattering glass broke the calm. It was sharp and sudden, cutting through the noise of the storm. Emily froze, her heart pounding as her mind scrambled for explanations. Before she could react, the faint beeping of the home security alarm echoed through the house. She set her mug down with trembling hands and stood, straining to hear any movement. The floor beneath her felt colder somehow, as if the temperature had dropped in an instant. She took a step toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent against the carpet. That's when she heard it, a heavy, deliberate footstep, followed by another. They weren't the hurried movements of someone trying to flee. Whoever was in her house was moving with purpose. Panic surged through her, and her thoughts flew to Lily and Noah. Emily's instincts told her to run to her children, but she didn't make it far. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision, and then a sudden, blinding pain exploded across her head. The world tilted, sounds stretching and distorting, until everything became muffled. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the floor. The metallic taste of blood touched her lips as her vision darkened. Somewhere far away she thought she heard her children's voices, Noah calling out, Lily crying, but she couldn't move. The sounds blended with the storm, the distant rumble of thunder rolling through her fading consciousness. A final image burned into her mind, the faint outline of a figure standing over her, unmoving, like a shadow solidified in the dim kitchen light. When the neighbors heard the alarm, they saw the storm-lit chaos inside the Carson home through the broken window. By the time police arrived, the scene was eerily still. Upstairs, Lily and Noah were found lifeless in their beds. Emily lay on the kitchen floor, unconscious, blood pooling beneath her head. She was breathing barely but entirely unaware that her world had already been destroyed. The following morning, the small town awoke to the kind of news that seemed impossible to believe. Word spread quickly, first among neighbors, then across the entire community, that tragedy had struck the Carson home. Police cars and an ambulance had lined the quiet street through the early hours, their flashing lights casting eerie glows over the wet pavement. Officers had worked silently and methodically, their grim expressions revealing more than their words ever could. Emily had been rushed to the hospital, still unconscious, while detectives and forensic teams remained inside the house. Outside, clusters of neighbors huddled under umbrellas, whispering in disbelief. This was the kind of violence that people imagined happening far away, not here, not to someone they saw every day. Parents instinctively held their children closer that morning, and locked doors were double-checked in homes all over town. Detectives began piecing together the initial details, but the crime scene offered few answers. The broken glass in the kitchen appeared to be the only obvious sign of forced entry, and yet it raised questions. It wasn't clear whether the intruder had come in through the kitchen window or if it had been broken after the fact. Nothing in the home seemed to have been stolen. Valuable electronics were still in place, wallets and jewelry untouched. This was not the work of someone looking for quick money. The children's bedrooms were hauntingly undisturbed. Toys were neatly placed where they had been the day before, clothes folded on chairs, drawings taped to the walls. There were no signs of a struggle, as though Lily and Noah had been caught in their final moments while still asleep. For detectives, that detail was chilling. It suggested that whoever had done this had moved quietly and deliberately, with a kind of calm that was deeply unsettling. The absence of clear motive troubled investigators from the start. When family or friends were questioned, they painted a picture of a devoted mother with no known enemies. Emily's life was quiet, her circle small, her days predictable. Nothing about her history seemed to invite this level of violence. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that the attack was personal. The precision of the crime, the choice to harm the children first, the silence of the act, the injury to Emily, hinted at someone who knew the family's routines. Local news stations quickly picked up the story, their broadcasts blending shock with unease. Reporters described Emily's condition as critical and the search for the person responsible as urgent. Police encouraged anyone with information to come forward, but the phone lines remained mostly silent. Without witnesses or clear forensic evidence, progress stalled almost immediately. By nightfall, the street where Emily lived had transformed from a friendly suburban lane into a place marked by fear. Neighbors avoided looking too long at the Carson house, as though its walls still held the echo of what had happened inside. For the moment, the killer had vanished into the storm, leaving behind a town gripped by the terrifying realization that whoever had done this might be closer than anyone dared to think. As days turned into weeks, the investigation into the Carson murders began to shift from the immediate search for a suspect to a deeper exploration of Emily's life. Detectives pored over her financial records, her phone history and her social connections, hoping to find something that might explain why such a targeted and brutal attack had occurred. On the surface, Emily's life seemed ordinary, even modest, but small details began to emerge that complicated the picture. One discovery caught investigators' attention early on. Just 3 months before the tragedy, Emily had taken out a sizable life insurance policy. It covered both herself and her children, and in the event of their deaths, the payout would go to her next of kin. While it wasn't unusual for parents to secure life insurance, the timing struck detectives as suspicious. They began to wonder if someone close to Emily might have seen an opportunity in that policy. Her financial records showed that she had been struggling quietly. Credit card debt had been slowly climbing, and her part-time job at the library barely covered the essentials. Friends later revealed that Emily had been reluctant to talk about her money problems, preferring to maintain the image of stability for the sake of her children. It wasn't until detectives began mapping out her last few months that they noticed a pattern. Emily had been in contact with relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, particularly her younger brother Daniel, and a cousin who lived in another state. Interviews with family members painted a mixed picture. Some described Emily as cautious and private, someone unlikely to share details of her life unless she trusted you completely. Others hinted at old tensions within the family, disagreements over money and property that had never been fully resolved. These underlying frictions, combined with the insurance policy, made detectives wonder if the motive for the crime had been rooted not in random violence, but in something much more personal. Still, no one stood out as a clear suspect. There were no eyewitnesses placing anyone near the Carson home that night, and no camera footage from nearby streets had captured anything useful. The storm had masked noises and kept most neighbors inside, erasing potential opportunities for someone to see or hear what happened. For every theory the detectives developed, the lack of evidence forced them to set it aside. Meanwhile, Emily remained in a coma, her condition stable but unchanged. The hope that she might eventually recall the events of that night was the only reason detectives didn't officially label the case as cold. They knew that if she woke up, she could provide details no one else could. Until then, they were left with fragments, financial strain, strained family ties, and the unshakable sense that the killer had been someone who knew exactly what they were doing. In the absence of answers, fear and suspicion began to spread through the community. Friends and relatives eyed one another differently, wondering if the person responsible was walking freely among them, blending in as though nothing had happened. The peace the town once knew was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that grew heavier with each passing day without an arrest. 2 months had passed since the night that tore Emily's life apart. In that time, the seasons had begun to shift, the crisp chill of autumn giving way to the first signs of winter. At the hospital, the steady rhythm of machines kept Emily alive. Her room was always dimly lit, a place where time seemed suspended. Nurses checked on her regularly, speaking to her softly even though she couldn't respond. Friends and a few family members visited, leaving flowers or cards, hoping she might hear their voices and be comforted. But day after day, Emily lay still, her body mending slowly while her mind remained locked in silence. Doctors described her condition as a deep coma, brought on by the severe head trauma she'd suffered. They couldn't predict when or if she would wake. Brain injuries were unpredictable, and any recovery would be slow and fragile. The detectives on her case visited often, standing quietly at her bedside, knowing she might hold the key to the truth. Without her testimony, the investigation was frozen in place, each lead running dry before it could lead anywhere useful. While Emily's physical wounds were healing, her mind was caught in a fog. Beneath that stillness, flashes of memory flickered and disappeared, shadows moving across a hallway, the sound of rain on glass, the faint echo of her children's voices. None of it stayed long enough to piece together, and her unconscious mind offered no way to speak it aloud. Still, something deep within her seemed to be fighting to surface. Outside the hospital, the case had faded from the daily news. Other headlines had replaced it, and though the Carson murders were still whispered about in the town, the intensity of the initial shock had dulled. For the detectives, however, it remained an open wound. They reviewed the evidence repeatedly, hoping that re-examining it might reveal something overlooked, but without new information, their hands were tied. Emily's doctors encouraged patience, warning that forcing her to recall the trauma too quickly if she woke could be dangerous. The human brain sometimes buried painful memories as a way of protecting itself. Rushing her could push those memories further away or cause her health to decline. So they waited, tending to her body while hoping her mind would eventually follow. In the quiet moments of the night, when the hospital hallways were nearly silent, Emily's breathing would sometimes quicken, as if she were trapped inside a vivid dream. Her fingers twitched, her eyelids flickered, but still she did not open her eyes. These small movements did not go unnoticed. Nurses began to wonder if the stirrings were a sign that she was trying to find her way back. Every day she remained unconscious. The line between hope and despair grew thinner. For the town, justice felt more distant with each passing week. For the detectives, the waiting was unbearable. And for Emily, somewhere deep in the darkness, the pieces of that terrible night were slowly beginning to gather, ready to push through the fog when the time came. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, weeks after the first signs that Emily's body was beginning to stir. The winter sun was pale through the hospital windows, casting a cold light over the room. Emily lay as she had for months, her breathing steady, her face relaxed, when her fingers moved again, this time not in the random twitch the nurses had grown used to, but in a slow, deliberate motion. Moments later, her eyelids fluttered open. The nurses rushed to her side, calling for the doctor, their voices urgent but careful. After so long in darkness, the light seemed to sting her eyes, and she turned her head slightly, as if shielding herself from the world she was re-entering. Her return was cautious and slow. At first, she could barely manage to focus her gaze or respond to simple questions. The doctors explained to her family that she would need time to reorient herself. Her speech came haltingly, words breaking apart under the weight of confusion. She didn't know the date. She couldn't remember the hospital or why she was there. Even the simplest facts felt slippery, as though her mind was holding them just out of reach. But the fragments of that night were still there, buried deep. They came first as sensations, sounds, smells, and fleeting images with no context. She remembered the sound of rain against a window, heavy breathing that wasn't her own, and the faint metallic tang of blood. She saw flashes of movement in a narrow hallway, the dark outline of someone standing still, watching. These fragments surfaced during her therapy sessions, sometimes triggered by a question, sometimes appearing out of nowhere, leaving her shaken and exhausted. The detectives, though desperate for answers, were told to wait. The doctors warned that pressing Emily too soon could overwhelm her, causing her mind to shut down again. And so the memories came in fragments, assembling themselves like jagged pieces of a puzzle over days and nights. One evening, as a therapist guided her through a memory exercise, something shifted. The shadows in her mind began to take shape, and the hallway she had seen so many times became clearer. She remembered running toward her children's rooms, panic tightening in her chest. Then, standing halfway between her and their bedrooms, there was a face she knew, a face that should never have been there that night. It was Daniel, her younger brother. The memory sharpened, with painful clarity, the glint of anger in his eyes, the weight of betrayal in that split second before he swung something heavy at her head. She remembered the blow, the sound of her own body hitting the floor, and the helplessness that followed as the world turned black. When the image finally locked into place, it was as if a door had been opened. The fear, the confusion, the months of silence, they all gave way to a cold, devastating certainty. She now knew exactly who had destroyed her family, and there was no going back. When Emily spoke her brother's name to the detectives, the room seemed to shift. For months, they had been chasing shadows, but now the investigation had a direction, one that struck directly at the heart of her family. Daniel Carson was 30 years old, with a history of drifting from job to job and an uneven relationship with his sister. On the surface, he had been supportive after Emily's accident, visiting her once at the hospital and speaking to relatives about how unfair the tragedy was. But in hindsight, his presence during those weeks now seemed carefully measured, as though he had been checking to see if she would survive. The detectives quietly began building their case. They obtained a warrant to search Daniel's small apartment on the edge of town. What they found there was unsettling: a pair of sneakers with faint reddish-brown stains, later confirmed through testing to be the children's blood, and a set of tools, one of which matched the dimensions of the wound on Emily's head. In a drawer, they uncovered financial documents showing Daniel was drowning in debt, overdue credit card bills, eviction notices, and gambling losses that stretched back more than a year. The most damning discovery came from his phone. Detectives retrieved text messages between Daniel and an acquaintance in which he complained about his sister's perfect life, and hinted at a plan to finally solve his money problems. The timeline matched the period shortly after Emily had taken out the life insurance policy. Although she had never told him the full details, investigators believed he had learned enough to know the payout could be substantial, and that, as her closest living relative, he would inherit it. When confronted with the evidence, Daniel denied everything at first, claiming he had been at home the night of the murders. But his alibi crumbled under scrutiny. Phone records placed him near Emily's house in the hours before the crime, and surveillance footage from a gas station 2 miles away captured his car, leaving the area shortly after the time police believed the killings occurred. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing picture emerged. Daniel had not acted in a fit of rage. He had planned the attack. Detectives believed he had chosen a stormy night to mask noises and reduce the chances of witnesses. His calm movements through the house, the lack of disturbance in the children's rooms, and the way he had targeted Emily last all pointed to a cold, calculated plan. For Emily, the betrayal was almost as crushing as the loss of her children. She had trusted her brother, helped him when he was struggling, and never imagined he was capable of such cruelty. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, she felt a strange mix of relief and devastation. The person she had loved as family had stood in her home that night, weapon in hand, with the intent to erase her life entirely. The motive was simple: money, but the cost was beyond measure. The trial of Daniel Carson drew intense attention, both from the local community and the surrounding counties. For many, it was still unthinkable that a brother could commit such a calculated and brutal act against his own family. Court proceedings began nearly a year after the murders, and from the start, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The prosecution presented the case with unrelenting detail: photographs of the crime scene, forensic evidence linking Daniel to the children's deaths, and the chilling testimony of Emily herself, who recounted every fragment of memory she had fought to recover. Her voice was steady, but the weight behind her words left the courtroom silent. The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting the evidence was circumstantial, but their arguments were overshadowed by the undeniable connections: the sneakers with the children's blood, the tool that matched her head injury, the phone records, and the messages about his financial desperation created a web that Daniel could not escape. When the prosecution laid out the theory that Daniel's plan had been to kill Emily as well, ensuring the life insurance payout would come directly to him, even the jurors' expressions hardened. Witnesses from Daniel's past were brought forward, painting a picture of a man who had often taken advantage of others' kindness, borrowing money with no intention of paying it back, and growing resentful when people refused to help. His gambling addiction had left him cornered, desperate, and willing to cross lines most would never consider. The night of the murders, prosecutors argued, was the culmination of months of planning and silent resentment. Emily sat through every day of the trial, her eyes fixed on her brother but without a word to him. Her presence was a quiet reminder of his failure. He had meant to silence her forever, and yet here she was, the one who had ultimately unmasked him. The moments when photographs of Lily and Noah were shown were the hardest. She kept her composure, but her hands trembled in her lap. Those images were not just evidence, they were memories of the life she had lost and could never reclaim. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom held its breath. Daniel was found guilty on all counts: 2 charges of first-degree murder and 1 of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again walk free. There was no visible reaction from Daniel, only the same blank stare he had worn through much of the trial. For Emily, the verdict brought a strange mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but there was no undoing what had been done. Her children were gone, her trust in family destroyed, and the home she once cherished felt like a place from another lifetime. She left the town shortly after the trial ended, moving to a quiet, undisclosed location where she could grieve in private. Though she carried scars both visible and hidden, she also carried the truth and the knowledge that she had fought her way back from darkness to ensure her children's story was heard.